Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The library was the kind of place most people avoided. Not because it was overtly terrifying, but because of the silence that hung thick in the air. The smell of old paper and dust seemed to cling to the walls like an ancient spell. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, with rows upon rows of books that no one ever really touched. Eleanor was a librarian who had worked in this very library for over a decade. She knew every corner of the place, every creak of the old wooden floors. Most of the books were worn, their covers faded, and their pages yellowed with age. But it was her sanctuary, a world filled with stories, real and imagined. She was content in her solitude. One rainy evening, as the storm raged outside, Eleanor sat at her desk, sipping tea and going through the daily maintenance tasks. The library was nearly empty, save for a few late visitors. The quiet was punctuated only by the sound of raindrops against the windows. That's when she noticed it, a book that wasn't there before. It sat on the counter, resting as though it had always been there, waiting for her to notice. The book was strange, unlike anything she had ever seen. Its cover was made from a material she couldn't quite identify, but it looked almost alive. The surface was smooth, yet there was something unsettling about it, as if it was not made of leather or cloth, but something far more organic. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cover. A chill ran through her, but she shrugged it off as a trick of the cold air. With curiosity gnawing at her, Eleanor picked up the book and opened it. The pages were crisp, but the ink was dark and bold, as though freshly written. She scanned the first few lines, but to her surprise, the text seemed odd, disturbingly familiar. The book began to describe a library, one that looked strikingly similar to the one she worked in. The passages described a librarian. Her name was even written there, Eleanor. She shivered, putting the book down for a moment. Was this some kind of joke? She didn't remember ordering a new book, let alone one that seemed to know her name. But there it was. The book had detailed her life with unsettling accuracy. It described her movements, her quiet evenings, the tea she liked to drink, and the exact chair she sat in. It seemed to know things about her that no one else did. She turned the pages in a mixture of awe and dread. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered to herself, eyes wide with disbelief. As she flipped the pages, her heart began to race. The book didn't just know about her. It was describing her future. It described an event that would happen later that evening, a moment she hadn't even planned. The words on the page were clear. At 9:47 p.m., the librarian will hear a knock on the door. She will open it and find a man, drenched and out of breath. He will speak of a curse, but his warnings will come too late. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she read the words. The clock on the wall ticked on, and she glanced nervously at the time. It was already 9:30 p.m. Her mind raced. She tried to make sense of it all, but her thoughts kept spiraling. Was this some kind of prank? A work of fiction? Or had she stumbled upon something much darker? As the minutes passed, Eleanor felt an uncomfortable pressure building in the room, as if the air had thickened. The book's presence seemed to grow heavier, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. At exactly 9:47 p.m., there was a loud knock on the library door. Eleanor froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. She stood up slowly, the book still open on the desk, its words glaring up at her with haunting clarity. She felt as though the world had shifted somehow, that something unseen was controlling her every move. The knock echoed again, this time more insistent. She didn't want to open the door. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to lock herself away and pretend nothing was happening. But the book that seemed to know so much, was telling her to answer. With shaking hands, she walked toward the door. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the windows as if warning her to stay inside. She reached for the doorknob, hesitated, and then twisted it open. Standing in front of her was a man, drenched from the rain, his clothes sticking to his body. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, wild with panic. "Please," he gasped, voice hoarse. "You have to listen to me. The book, it's cursed. You don't understand. It's not just a story. It's a trap, a nightmare that never ends. It's rewriting itself. It's rewriting your life." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. His warning was enough to send a chill down her spine. How could he know? How could he possibly know? She glanced at the book, its pages turning on their own, as if something invisible was flipping them. The text was changing, shifting. It wasn't just recounting her life anymore. It was predicting what would happen next. The man grabbed her arm, his grip tight and urgent. "You have to burn it," he pleaded, "before it's too late. Before it takes you too." Eleanor's mind raced. The book was alive. It was controlling everything. It had already begun to rewrite her life. The man took a step back, his eyes darting nervously to the door. "You don't understand," he repeated, shaking his head. "It never lets go. You can't outrun it." Eleanor wanted to ask him who he was, why he knew so much, but before she could speak, the book's pages began to glow, the ink turning bright red, then black, as though the very essence of the words was bleeding onto the page. It was happening, just like the book had said. She turned to the man, her voice trembling. "What do I do?" His eyes widened in terror, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw something in them, something dark, something terrible. Then he turned and fled into the night, leaving her alone with the book. The door slammed shut behind him, and the library seemed to close in around her. The clock struck 10 p.m., and Eleanor knew, deep down, that she would never be the same again. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest. She could still hear the man's frantic footsteps fading into the distance, his words echoing in her mind. "You can't outrun it. You have to burn it." The library felt colder now, as though the walls themselves had grown thinner, more fragile. The air was thick, stifling. She looked down at the book in her hands, the pages now blackened, writhing with new, unsettling words. She couldn't look away. Something deep inside her was telling her that the book was no longer just an inanimate object. It was a force, a power, something beyond understanding. Her fingers hovered over the pages, and as though it had a will of its own, the book flipped open to a new section. The ink on the pages darkened, twisting into shapes that made her stomach churn. A new line appeared in front of her eyes, one she hadn't seen before. The librarian will attempt to destroy the book, but the book will always find its way back to her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She swallowed hard, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. She knew that there was no escaping it. The book was already entwined with her life, her fate. There was no way out. But she had to try. She had to do something. Eleanor bolted toward the fireplace. The cold in the room seemed to have a hold on her now, seeping into her very bones. She grabbed the nearest log, her hands shaking as she set it into the fire. The flames crackled to life, and for a moment, she felt a small sense of comfort. She looked back at the book, its pages flipping violently, as though it was alive, struggling against the inevitable. The text began to rewrite itself again, detailing her every action. The librarian will try to burn the book, but the flames will never touch its pages. Her pulse quickened. This isn't real, she thought. It can't be real. With trembling hands, she tossed the book into the fire. At first, the flames flared brighter, but the book didn't burn. Instead, the pages turned to a deep, glowing red, and the fire seemed to dance around it, not touching the cursed pages. It was as if the flames were afraid, as though the book had some unseen power over them. Eleanor stepped back, a scream rising in her throat. She had no idea what she was dealing with. She had to get out, get away from the library before it consumed her too. But as she turned to flee, She felt a sharp, cold tug at her heart, as though the book was pulling her back, calling her to it. With one last, desperate glance at the fire, she ran toward the door, hoping to escape. But when she reached for the handle, she felt it, the cold presence of the book behind her, lingering, waiting for her. The door wouldn't open. Her panic grew, and she turned to face the room, her mind racing. The book was still there, still glowing in the fire, and she knew it was watching her. It's too late, she thought. There's nowhere to run. Suddenly, the room began to change. The air thickened even more, pressing down on her chest, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Eleanor gasped for breath, her body trembling as she felt the room close in on her. The book was rewriting everything around her, altering the very fabric of reality. The library's quiet corners shifted. The aisles of books became labyrinthine, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The windows, once clear, now reflected only darkness, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Her heart raced. She had to escape. She had to. A soft, whispering sound interrupted her thoughts. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder, clearer. She could hear her own name being called. The voice was distorted, hollow, as if coming from the very walls themselves. Eleanor. She spun around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no one there. No sign of the man who had warned her, no sign of anyone. Just the oppressive silence, the dark, suffocating silence that seemed to smother every corner of the library. Eleanor, the voice repeated, now a low, mocking whisper. The book was still glowing on the desk, its pages flicking in the air as if caught in an invisible wind. She couldn't stop herself. She had to look. Something inside her urged her to see what it would say next. She approached the desk again, feeling the pull, like the book was an extension of her own thoughts. It seemed to know her better than she knew herself. The text continued to change, the ink swirling like liquid darkness. The librarian will become the book's new keeper. She will serve its purpose. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. Serve its purpose? What purpose? What did that even mean? As she stared at the words, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The voice now seemed to come from within her own mind, as though the book was reaching into her thoughts, pulling her deeper into its twisted narrative. Don't resist, the voice whispered. You're already a part of it. The book will always find its way back to you. The words bled into one another, filling her thoughts, drowning out her own voice. The book's power was overwhelming, suffocating her in ways she couldn't explain. Eleanor staggered back, clutching her head, her breath shallow. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in once again. She felt the cold fingers of the book's influence tightening around her, pulling her toward the inevitable. No, she gasped, the word barely escaping her lips. I won't. I won't. But the book wasn't listening. It never had to. It had already chosen her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the passing of time in the oppressive silence. And as the shadows around her seemed to grow darker, deeper, Eleanor knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was already a part of the story, and there was no escape. The darkness in the room thickened. Eleanor's eyes flicked between the book and the swirling shadows that seemed to inch toward her like something alive. Her heartbeat raced. The library, once a place of quiet comfort, had transformed into a prison, its walls pressing in from every side. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices. Each whisper was her name, each one more insistent than the last. Her mind spun with confusion and fear. She needed to get out, but she couldn't move. It felt as though the very air itself had turned to stone, freezing her in place. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body heavy, as though she were sinking into the ground. She looked toward the desk, and her breath hitched in her throat. The book had changed again. The pages were no longer turning by themselves. Instead, they began to glow, the ink shifting and moving like liquid, as though the words themselves were alive. They were no longer just predictions of the future. they were commands. The librarian will not escape. She will become part of the story, her soul written on the pages forever. The words burned into her mind, searing through her thoughts like a hot iron. No, she thought, I am not part of this. But the more she tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. Her hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached for the book, though she didn't want to. She could feel it calling to her, pulling her closer, making her hands move against her will. As her fingers brushed the pages, a sharp, searing pain shot through her fingertips, as if the ink were burning into her skin. She gasped, pulling her hand away, but the damage was done. Her skin, where the book had touched it, had turned a dark, raw red, as though something beneath it had been awakened. She stumbled back, clutching her hand to her chest, her mind racing in panic. She had to do something. She had to stop this. A soft laugh echoed around the room, low and sinister. Eleanor spun around, searching for the source of the sound. But there was no one there. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls of the library, twisting in her ears. You can't escape, the voice mocked, now clear and distinct. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was a full, unmistakable voice, malevolent and cold. It was the book. Somehow, it was speaking to her directly. The room began to shift again. The shelves, once filled with books, began to melt, the spines warping, their contents seeping out like black tar. The floor beneath her feet groaned and cracked, and the walls seemed to close in tighter, as though the library was turning into a living, breathing thing. The librarian will stay here, the voice purred. She will be part of the library, part of the story, forever. Eleanor's eyes darted around, desperate for any escape, but there was nothing. The door, the windows, they were all gone, replaced by the writhing, twisting shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The very air itself seemed to be alive with the book's power. The laughter continued, growing louder, more mocking, until it felt like it was inside her skull. Her mind screamed, but her mouth wouldn't move. The book had claimed her, body and soul. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as the voices inside her mind grew louder, overlapping, until they were all she could hear. You are ours now, the voices whispered, their tone a mix of hunger and glee. You will never leave. You will never be free. The book has claimed you. But just as she thought she could no longer bear it, the voices fell silent. The room fell still. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eleanor dared to look up. The book lay there, its pages turned, waiting for her. The words on the page began to shift once more. But this time, there was no prediction. There was no rewriting of her life. This time, it was personal. Eleanor, the book read aloud, in the same mocking tone the voice had used before. The librarian will be the story's new keeper, bound to its pages. She will live here forever, trapped in the library, a part of the tale that will never end. A new wave of terror washed over her. Forever? Could she truly be trapped here, in this cursed place, for all eternity? But then she felt something that hadn't been there before. A movement in the shadows. A flicker, like a figure passing in the corner of her vision. Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart pounding once again as she turned, slowly, to face the darkness. The figure was tall, silhouetted against the deep shadows, but she could make out no features, just a shape. And then, with a chilling calmness, the figure stepped forward into the dim light. It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned her. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as though something had drained the life from him. He looked at her with a kind of sad resignation. The book. It never stops, he said, his voice flat. Once it's chosen you, it becomes a part of you. It changes you. You become one with it. Eleanor's eyes widened. What do you mean? How do you know? She whispered, her voice trembling. The man gave a slow, sorrowful shake of his head. I tried to burn it. I tried to get rid of it, but it kept coming back. It always does. It finds a new keeper. It chooses them, and then, They are never free again. Eleanor felt her heart sink. This man, he had been just like her. He had fallen into the same trap. He had become a part of the book's twisted story. No, she gasped, her voice breaking. I don't want this. I don't want to be part of it. The man's hollow eyes met hers. You have no choice. None of us do. With those words, the man's form began to blur, fading into the shadows as if he were dissolving into the air itself. The room around her shifted again. The walls, the shelves, the book, it was all becoming one, swirling and merging, until there was no distinction between the library and the book, between reality and fiction. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the truth. The book wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a prison, a living entity that consumed everything it touched. And now it had claimed her, and she would be trapped inside its pages for eternity. The last thing she saw before everything dissolved into darkness was the book. Its pages turned, and a new line appeared, scrawled in blood-red ink. Eleanor is now part of the story. She will never leave. She will never escape. The darkness engulfed her. It pressed in from all sides, squeezing the air out of her lungs until she could barely breathe. It wasn't just a void. It was a place between worlds, where time and space had no meaning, no distinction. She was lost in it, trapped in the endless black, floating in a kind of eternal limbo. For what felt like an eternity, Eleanor's mind was a swirl of panic and confusion. She couldn't remember how long she had been there, seconds, hours, days. Time had no meaning in this place. She didn't know where her body ended and the darkness began. It was as though she had become part of the void itself, a forgotten fragment of the world. But then something shifted, a distant sound. It was faint at first, like the echo of a faraway voice, but it grew louder, clearer. It was the same voice she had heard before, the mocking, insistent whisper of the book. Eleanor, the voice echoed through the darkness, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible hand. Do you think you can escape? Do you think you can outrun your fate? Her heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was all around her, coming from the very air, from the shadows that surrounded her. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. I won't let it take me. But the darkness responded, pressing in on her, pulling her down deeper, as though the void was aware of her resistance. It didn't want her to fight it. It wanted her to accept it, to let it consume her. You are already mine, the voice hissed. You belong to the book now. Forever. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had consumed her, it began to unravel. The world around her shifted. The shadows faded into the corners of her vision, and slowly, the oppressive blackness began to recede, revealing something far worse. Eleanor blinked, her mind still reeling, as the library came back into focus. The walls, the shelves, the desk, they were all there, but they were different now. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very room had been transformed into something alive. The book lay open on the desk, its pages now completely black, its ink dripping like liquid darkness onto the wooden surface below. The room itself seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, vibrating like the surface of water disturbed by some unseen force. And then something worse happened. The pages of the book began to turn, not by themselves, but as if someone were turning them, slowly, deliberately. The ink bled onto the pages, forming new words, new sentences. Each line was like a fresh wound, an incision into her very soul. Eleanor will never escape. She will never be free. She will serve the book for eternity. She stepped backward, her feet stumbling as her mind tried to grasp what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. She had to be dreaming. There had to be a way out. But the book, the cursed book, was rewriting everything. The room, her life, her soul. There was no way out. The laughter returned, low and guttural, and Eleanor realized it was no longer coming from the air. It was coming from the book itself. The sound echoed in her ears, like the mocking laugh of a predator circling its prey. No, Eleanor whispered, her throat dry, her voice cracking with fear. "No, please. I didn't mean to. I didn't." But the book didn't care. It wasn't interested in her pleas. It was interested in one thing, and one thing only, her. With a final, sickening twist, the pages stopped turning. The ink froze on the page, as if satisfied with its work. And then, to her horror, the book did something that defied all logic. It opened its cover wider, as if the book were expanding, stretching, bending the very space around it. Eleanor could feel it, this unnatural force, pressing against her, tugging at her very being. Her body trembled as she watched the book's spine crack, as though it were about to tear open. The voice, now louder, more insistent, returned, filling her mind and drowning out everything else. "You will be a part of me, Eleanor. You will never leave." Her mind screamed in terror. She tried to pull away, tried to resist, but her legs wouldn't move. The air around her became thick with an unseen force, as though it were pulling her toward the book, forcing her to submit. And then the book spoke again, its voice louder than ever. "You will become one with the pages. Your story will be written, and there will be no end. You will live forever in the book." In a final, desperate attempt, Eleanor reached toward the desk, grabbed the edges of the book, and tried to force it shut. But her hands, her fingers, slipped right through the pages as if they were made of water. She gasped, her heart pounding, as she tried again, but the same thing happened. The book was no longer just an object. It was something else, something that fed on her. And then she realized, she wasn't just reading the book. She was becoming it. The ink swirled, twisting around her, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the room around her began to change again. The shelves, the books, the walls, they were all merging, twisting together. The familiar library was fading, being overwritten, rewritten by the very book she had tried to destroy. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself falling, not into the ground, but into the pages, into the ink, into the story itself. Her body was being consumed, dissolved into the blackness, until she no longer existed as Eleanor, the librarian. She was now part of the book, part of the never-ending tale that would stretch on forever. The world around her became a blur, her name lost to the void, her memories slipping away as the book wrote her into its story. Eleanor will remain here, the book wrote, forever bound to the pages. She will never escape. She is part of the story now. And with that, the book closed. The world was silent. For a long moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Just a cold, empty void where Eleanor had once stood. The darkness had swallowed her whole, and with it, her very existence had been erased. But then, ever so slowly, the silence began to crack. The edges of the void flickered, like the last remnants of a dream that refused to die. A small sliver of light pierced the blackness, and with it, a soft, insistent hum. The book. It was still there, lying on the desk. The cover was closed now, its pages still and silent. But something was different. Something had changed. The very air around it felt heavier. It hummed with a dark energy, as though the book itself was alive, feeding on whatever it had consumed. Eleanor's presence lingered in the room, a faint echo of her, as though her soul had been trapped between the pages, too shattered to escape. The book wasn't just a book anymore, it was a vessel that held all of her fear, her sorrow, her pain. The humming grew louder, then softer again. And with it, a new page appeared. The ink on the page was fresh, still wet, still moving, as though it was being written in real time. The letters were strange, jagged, almost alive, squirming like worms on the page. And as Eleanor watched, or rather, as her soul felt the pull of it, she saw her name, her very name, appear once again. Eleanor, it read. She will remain the keeper of the story. She will never leave. The book will consume her completely. Eleanor's heart, if it could still beat, would have been racing in fear. She wasn't dead, not in the traditional sense. She was something worse. Something trapped in the pages of the book, no longer part of the world she once knew. but a mere shadow of her former self. Her eyes, or what was left of them, could still see. They could still feel the cold weight of the ink, the oppressive silence that pressed down on her, and the knowledge that her story, her life, was now a permanent fixture in this cursed book. She tried to move, to fight, but there was nothing. She was bound to the pages, an eternal prisoner to the ink that had written her fate. And yet there was a flicker, something small like a spark of resistance. She remembered, no, she felt, the last moments of her life before the book had taken her. The terror, the panic, her desperate struggle. She hadn't given up then, and perhaps, just perhaps, she didn't have to give up now. The whispers started again, slow and haunting, as though the book was calling to her. They weren't just words, they were thoughts. Her thoughts, memories. The book was rewriting itself, yes, but it was also rewriting her. "You belong to me now," the voice crooned, soft and cruel. "You are mine. You will serve me forever." But something inside Eleanor stirred. A tiny flicker, a spark of defiance. She had been bound to this cursed book, yes, but there had to be a way to break free. There had to be a way to fight back. She couldn't just be erased, consumed by the very thing she had feared. She wouldn't let it happen. With all the strength she had left, if she still had any strength at all, Eleanor focused. She reached out, mentally, spiritually, whatever was left of her, and touched the book. Her fingers, though they were no longer real, no longer flesh, brushed against the pages. And in that moment, the book responded. The ink rippled beneath her touch, the words shifting, twisting, as though the book itself could feel her struggle. "You cannot escape," the book warned, the voice growing louder, more insistent. "You are mine. You will remain in the story forever." But Eleanor refused. She gathered the last of her will, pushing against the pull of the book. It was like swimming against a current, fighting against an invisible force that threatened to drown her. But she fought anyway, and then a breakthrough. The pages flipped. The ink writhed, pulling itself together, forming words that weren't her own. They were foreign, unfamiliar, as if someone or something else was writing in the book now. The air around her seemed to thicken, a heavy pressure pressing against her, but she didn't stop. She focused, each thought sharper than the last, pushing the darkness back, forcing the book to listen. And then a voice, different, darker, more ancient, spoke. "She fights," it murmured, its voice an echo that rattled through her very being. "But it is useless. She will never be free. No one ever is." Eleanor's heart clenched with terror, but she wouldn't give up. She had to escape. She had to find a way out. She had to fight back against the darkness. Suddenly, she felt the weight of the book grow heavier, as though something else was trying to push its way through. The pages began to ripple violently, as though they were alive, and she felt the ink curling, twisting around her, pulling her back into the story. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "I will not be your prisoner. I will not be part of this." But the book didn't listen. It couldn't. The pull of it was too strong. As her thoughts began to blur, Eleanor realized the horrible truth. The book wasn't just consuming her. It was rewriting her soul, bending her very essence into something else. Something that would never be free. And just like that, the book closed. The room was still again, silent and lifeless. The air was heavy, thick with the presence of the book, and everything felt wrong. A cold shiver ran through the space, like a lingering ghost that refused to leave. But Eleanor didn't feel it. She couldn't feel anything anymore. For a long time there was nothing, only darkness. But then a sound broke the stillness. Soft at first, like the rustling of paper, the gentle flutter of pages turning. And then louder, faster. The book was opening. Eleanor could sense it. She couldn't see, couldn't move, but she could feel the book's cold embrace pulling her in once again. She had been bound to it, trapped inside the story, and no matter how she fought, she was drawn back to it, piece by piece. The book's pages flickered open, and the same whispering voice filled the room, thick with malice. You cannot escape, Eleanor. You never will. This is your fate. But this time, there was something different about the voice. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was urgent, desperate, as though the book itself was frightened, as though it feared something. The pages kept turning, the ink swirling on the paper, forming words that made no sense, yet felt so familiar. Eleanor couldn't understand them, but she felt them. She could feel the words creeping inside her, slithering like worms beneath her skin. And then something horrifying happened. The pages stopped turning. The ink froze. And Eleanor, for the first time since this nightmare had started, felt the weight of her own body again. Her heart, or whatever was left of it, skipped a beat. She gasped, though she didn't need air. She could feel her lungs, her chest, her body, still there, still tethered to the earth, to the world she once knew. But it wasn't the same. She wasn't the same. She was different. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The horror of it all, the book, the darkness, the loss of her own identity, was overwhelming. She had become part of the story, but it was more than that. She wasn't just in the book. She was part of it, like an unfinished sentence, an unwritten chapter that could never be closed. But then, something stirred deep inside her. A memory, maybe? A flicker of the woman she had once been? Eleanor didn't know, but it was something. She wasn't gone. Not completely. The book had taken her, yes. But it had underestimated one thing. It had underestimated her will. She had been scared, terrified even. But in the darkest moments of this nightmare, something inside her had fought back. And now, that tiny spark was enough. You cannot erase me. The words were barely a whisper, but they were hers. Hers alone. And with that, a terrible cracking sound filled the room. It was the book. Its spine groaned, the edges of its pages curling and bending as though it were being torn from the inside. The ink, once dark and consuming, began to bleed. It dripped like liquid shadow onto the desk, pooling around her feet, as though the book itself was bleeding. And in that pool of ink, something began to rise. A figure. At first, it was nothing but a shape, a distorted, blurry outline. But then, slowly, it became clearer. Eleanor's own reflection, but twisted, deformed. Her face was wrong. It was her, but it wasn't. Her skin was pale and stretched, her eyes wide, hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. The very thing she had feared, the thing she had become. Her reflection smiled. But it wasn't a smile of joy or satisfaction. It was a grin of malice, of victory. Eleanor's breath, if she still had lungs, would have caught in her throat. This wasn't just the book rewriting her. This wasn't just her being trapped in its pages. No, the book had created something new, something terrible. And then it spoke. Her reflection, her other self, spoke, its voice a dark echo of her own. You thought you could fight back, Eleanor? You thought you could escape? It hissed, its voice a low growl. You are mine now. There is no escape from the pages. There is no freedom from the story. We are one. The reflection reached out toward her, its hand made of pure ink, reaching like a tendril of darkness. Eleanor's heart pounded, and she stumbled back, her mind racing. The room, the space she was in, was changing again. The shelves, the desk, the very air around her were warping, bending, as though they too were becoming part of the book. Her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The reflection inched closer, its grin widening as it reached for her. You will be forgotten, it whispered, its voice filled with hunger. You will be written out, a forgotten chapter in a story that never ends. Eleanor felt the cold touch of the ink, like ice against her skin, and a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. The ink spread, pouring over her, filling her mind, her body, until she could no longer feel herself. She was dissolving, fading into the black, her form slipping away like sand through her fingers. But even as the darkness consumed her, there was still something left. A sliver of resistance, a spark of defiance. No, she thought, I won't let it end like this. And with that, the darkness began to break. The blackness quivered, as though it could feel Eleanor's defiance. The ink that had consumed her body trembled, unsure of what to do next. For a fleeting moment, the crushing weight of the book loosened, as though the very fabric of her existence was being tested. Eleanor fought, pulling against the ink, trying to break free from the grasp of her own reflection. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but she felt every part of herself being torn apart, shredded into nothingness. Then something within her clicked, a distant, instinctual knowledge. She remembered the book's power. She had known it, and that was the key. The book couldn't rewrite her entirely. She was too much of herself still, despite what the darkness had done. Eleanor was not just ink and paper. She was flesh. She was soul. She was a story that had already been written, not one that could be erased completely. She focused on the memory of her life. The library, the soft rustle of pages, the smell of old books, the laughter of a life that was once hers. She clung to it with all the strength she could muster, grasping for any shred of her identity she could hold on to. The reflection, the dark, twisted thing that had once been her, paused. Its grin faltered, uncertainty creeping across its face. It could feel the change. Eleanor wasn't fading. She was resisting. She wasn't a part of the book yet. Not completely. "You cannot fight me," the reflection sneered, its voice twisting, warping like the pages themselves. "I am you. We are one." But Eleanor didn't listen. She pressed harder. The air around her shimmered, a crackling energy building as the ink on her skin began to burn. It wasn't painful, though. It was more like waking up after a long, deep sleep. It was painful because she was remembering. She was remembering who she was before the book, before the reflection, before it all. The ink began to crack, tiny fissures forming across her body like a web of light, and the reflection screamed. It was as if the very thing that held it together was starting to unravel. "No," it howled, its hands reaching out as if to pull her back, to drag her into the depths again. But Eleanor wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was focused only on one thing, the truth. The realization that she could break the cycle, that the book didn't control her. She controlled it. With a scream of her own, Eleanor stretched out her hands. The energy around her exploded in a flash of light, the pages of the book tearing apart, the ink evaporating into the air like smoke. Her reflection screeched, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Eleanor felt a rush of freedom. The room shattered. The bookshelves, the desk, the walls of the library, they all dissolved into nothing, as if they had never existed at all. The air, thick and oppressive just moments ago, was now strangely still and quiet. The weight in her chest lifted, and she breathed, deeply, urgently, and fully. She was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor could feel her heart beating in her chest. The silence that had been suffocating her was gone, replaced by a pure, cold stillness. The darkness was gone. But, as she looked around, she realized with a shock that she wasn't quite where she expected to be. The library, her world, was gone. Instead, she stood on a wide, empty plain, stretching out in all directions. There were no books, no walls, no desks, just the endless void. Eleanor's mind raced, confusion flooding her thoughts. She had broken free, yes, but where was she now? What was this place? How could the world feel so empty? It wasn't until she looked down that she realized the truth. She wasn't alive. Not entirely. She stood there, a pale shadow of herself, looking down at the ground. There was no warmth to her body, no sense of touch. She could see the outline of her own figure, but it was faint, almost translucent. Her hands were blurred at the edges, like a ghost. "No," she whispered, her voice strange and distant. "This can't be real." But it was real. She wasn't in the world she had known. She was somewhere else now, somewhere outside the story. And yet, she wasn't free. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She wasn't trapped in the book anymore, but the book had followed her here. It had twisted her, changed her, and now she was something new. something neither alive nor truly dead, something in between. And as she stared out at the desolate landscape, the air around her thick with dread, she realized the truth. The book had never really been about her. It wasn't just about one life, one person. It was about everything. About all the stories that had been written, all the lives that had been changed, all the souls that had been bound. And in the distance, something moved. Eleanor's heart, a heart that was no longer truly hers, raced, her body still and cold, but her mind alive with terror. In the far-off distance, beyond the plain, she saw something. Something coming toward her. It was a figure, dark and indistinct, but as it drew closer, she could see it clearly. It was the book, floating in the air, suspended as though by some unseen force. The book was coming for her. The book drifted through the air, its pages fluttering in an unseen wind, as though it were alive. It was no longer bound by human skin. No, it had become something else, something worse. The edges of the book were tattered, darkened by ink that pulsed like blood, throbbing with an unnatural life of its own. Eleanor's legs felt frozen, as if the ground beneath her had hardened to stone. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The book was drawing closer, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. It was inevitable. It was coming for her, just as it had always come for those it had claimed. The pages turned faster now, the sound of them slicing through the air like a blade cutting through flesh. The words on the pages swirled in the air, writing themselves in midair, forming letters and symbols that she couldn't understand. Symbols that made her stomach churn, symbols that felt wrong, foreign, but so familiar. "You are still mine." The voice wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere. In her head, in her bones, in the air around her. It was the book speaking, but it wasn't the same voice from before. This voice was deeper, darker, filled with ancient malice. It was the voice of the book's true nature, the voice of something that had existed for centuries, perhaps longer. The book floated in front of her now, its pages quivering, waiting for her to look. And against her will, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to the words. They wanted her to read them, wanted her to understand. But the words weren't about her past anymore. They were about her future. The pages turned, faster now, showing scenes of her life that hadn't happened yet. Her death. The words on the pages outlined her fate, one sentence at a time. She will walk through the flames. Eleanor tried to turn away, to block out the images, but it was impossible. The book was too strong. She could feel the events unfolding around her, even as they hadn't yet occurred. The words seeped into her skin, into her soul, as the book began to rewrite itself again, this time with a more sinister purpose. She will scream, but no one will hear her. Her heart raced. No, she didn't want this. She didn't want to die. But the words were clear. There was no escaping them. No escaping the future they promised. She will burn. She will drown. She will be consumed. Her chest tightened, the air growing thin, as though the very essence of her life was being drawn out of her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, cracks spreading like veins through the earth. A tremor of fear surged through her, but still she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. "This is your end, Eleanor." The book's voice was louder now, more commanding, filled with an ominous finality. "You belong to me. You always have. You always will." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were no longer tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of rage. She wasn't going to let this happen. She couldn't let it. The book had taken so much from her, but she wasn't going to give in. She wasn't going to be the thing that it wanted her to be. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Eleanor forced her hands to move. The ink that had once consumed her skin burned as she began to tear the pages from the air, trying to destroy the words that the book had written. But the book resisted. The pages reformed as quickly as she could rip them away. "You cannot stop this." The voice grew louder, almost mocking. "You cannot outrun your fate. You will always belong to me." Eleanor screamed, the sound echoing across the empty void. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to be consumed by this thing, this endless nightmare that the book had created. But as she screamed, the ground beneath her cracked wide open, and a violent wind whipped around her, pulling at her hair, her clothes, tearing at her very soul. The book hovered closer, the pages now glowing with a sickly light, the words on the pages flashing like lightning, sharp and painful to look at. And then, without warning, the book opened. Not in the air, not in front of her. No, it opened inside her. The spine cracked like the sound of bones breaking, and the pages flew inside her body, burrowing deep into her chest, her heart, her mind. Eleanor gasped, a sound of agony that echoed in the silence. She could feel the words carving themselves into her, marking her soul, her very essence. The pain was unbearable. Her body shook as the book filled her completely, drowning her in its pages, its ink, its story. The world around her seemed to melt, the endless plain of nothingness collapsing, folding in on itself. The book's power was too great. She couldn't escape. She was the book now. She was part of the story. She was part of the ink, the paper, the very darkness that had bound her. And then, as the last of her consciousness faded away, she understood. The book was never just about her. It had always been about everyone. It fed on their lives, on their stories. It was alive, and it had always been waiting for her. Her scream was the last sound she would make. Eleanor was gone, but the book was still there, its pages turning, its ink swirling, waiting for the next one to come along. And it would always wait. Time passed in strange, endless waves. It wasn't the passing of days or months, but something deeper, something older. The world that Eleanor had once known was gone, replaced by the creeping, quiet darkness of the book's eternal grasp. But even as the last traces of her memory dissolved into the ink, the book waited. It always waited. In another part of the world, far removed from the cursed library and the horrors of the skin book, a new chapter was beginning. Daniel, a young librarian, had just started at the very library where Eleanor's torment had unfolded. He was eager, excited even, to work in a place so full of history, of stories yet to be told. The library was large, sprawling, and ancient, with rows of dusty bookshelves that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled of old paper, of ink and leather, a scent that always made Daniel feel at home. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. He walked through the aisles, humming softly to himself as he dusted off books and arranged them on the shelves. But as he moved through the library, something caught his eye. A peculiar section, tucked away in the farthest corner of the building. There were no signs marking it, no indication of what was stored there. The shelves were old, weathered, covered in layers of dust. It was as if no one had dared to touch this corner for years. Intrigued, Daniel approached. He ran his fingers along the spine of one of the books, the texture rough beneath his skin. As he pulled the book out, he noticed something strange. The spine was covered in faint, almost imperceptible markings. Symbols. They seemed to shift under his touch, as if the book itself was alive. His heart began to race. What was this? He opened the book carefully, almost reverently, and was immediately struck by the strange sensation that flooded over him. The words on the pages weren't printed in any language he recognized. They swirled, changing, twisting like a living thing, forming sentences and paragraphs before dissolving and reforming again. The letters seemed to crawl across the page, alive, breathing, beckoning him forward. Daniel's hands trembled. He should have stopped, should have put the book down, returned it to the shelf, and forgotten about it. But something in him, something deep, primal, urged him to keep reading. It felt important. It felt like he needed to know what was written there. The book pulled him in, word by word, sentence by sentence. As he read, he felt his world start to blur, as though the room around him was fading. The air grew heavier, the shadows longer, as if the very fabric of reality was bending, reshaping itself to the words on the pages. He turned the pages faster now, unable to stop himself. The book was calling to him. Then, the words changed again, no longer random and twisting, but direct. They began to describe him, his life, his past, his present. It was as if the book had suddenly known everything about him. It was like reading his own diary, but somehow more intimate, more invasive. He could feel the book's power pressing down on him, wrapping around him, as if it were taking hold of his very soul. "Daniel, you think you are safe, but you are not." The voice in the back of his mind whispered those words, though it wasn't his voice. It was the book's voice. It was everywhere, inside his head, in his chest, in his very bones. "You belong to me now." Daniel froze. The room around him darkened, the lights flickering overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He tried to close the book, but it wouldn't let him. It resisted. It pulled him deeper into its grip, and he could feel the tendrils of the ink reaching for him, curling around his body like cold fingers. "This is your fate," the book whispered. "You will be part of my story. You will be written in my pages." Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest, the book's words still echoing in his mind. He tried to pull away, to run, but it was too late. The book had already begun to rewrite him. His hands were shaking violently as the ink began to seep from the pages, curling into the air, swirling like dark smoke. It reached out toward him, wrapping itself around his body. "No!" Daniel screamed, trying to tear himself free, but the ink was too strong. It was everywhere now, coating his skin, filling his mouth, suffocating him. He could feel it, the words writing themselves inside him, inside his very mind. It was the same feeling Eleanor had felt, the same feeling that had consumed her. He struggled, his mind screaming for escape, but the book's grip tightened. The words continued to write themselves, tracing the outline of his life, his past, his present, his future. There was no escaping it, no escaping the story that had already been written for him. And then, just as the book had taken Eleanor, it took him. Time blurred after Daniel's final scream. The library returned to its eerie quiet, untouched by the horror that had unfolded within its walls. The book, now closed, sat innocently on the shelf once again, as if nothing had ever happened. Its cover was unmarked, its pages sealed in silence. No trace of the struggle, no sign of the soul it had claimed remained. But the book had changed. It had consumed Daniel's essence, and in doing so, it had woven him into its dark tapestry, making him a part of its endless story. His life was no longer his own. It had become ink, paper, and shadow, bound forever in the cursed words of the skin book. Outside the library, the world continued, oblivious to the evil that lurked just beneath the surface. The sun rose and set, days turned to weeks, weeks to months. But the library, its air still thick with the scent of old books and dust, was never quite the same. No one suspected the horrors that lay hidden in that forgotten corner. Not yet. Not until another would come along, another whose fate would be sealed the moment their hands touched the book. And so it was that, months later, a new librarian, Jessica, arrived. She had heard whispers of the strange happenings at the library, the odd disappearances of the old staff, the rumors of the forbidden section in the back, of a book that no one dared touch. But Jessica was different. She was eager, determined to make her mark in the world, to prove herself as more than just a young woman with lofty ambitions. She had heard the stories, yes, but she dismissed them. She was not afraid. Her first day on the job felt like any other. The library was quiet, peaceful. It was exactly the kind of place she had always wanted to work. She walked down the aisles, cataloging the new books that had come in. Her eyes wandered toward the back of the room, toward the old section that no one seemed to go near. Curiosity tugged at her. She had heard the rumors. The stories about the forbidden books, the ones no one dared to touch. But it was all superstition, wasn't it? Just stories. As Jessica's hand brushed across the spines of the books, she felt a strange chill run through her, but she shrugged it off. She was just being silly. Still, something about the corner felt wrong. She couldn't explain it. but it was as though the books in this section had been waiting for her, watching her from the shadows. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the spine of a book that seemed different from the rest. It wasn't as old as the others, and yet it felt heavier. It seemed to pull her in, almost as if it were alive. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingers traced the contours of its cover, the faded symbols that seemed to shimmer under her touch. It was then that the voice inside her mind whispered, "You belong to me now." Jessica froze. The words weren't her thoughts. They weren't even a sound, but more of a feeling deep within her chest. The words were not new to her. They felt as though they had always been there, waiting for her to hear them. The book. It was speaking to her. Her heart pounded in her ears, but her hand moved as if guided by some invisible force, pulling the book from the shelf. The moment the book left its resting place, she felt a wave of dizziness rush over her. Her vision blurred, and she staggered backward, gripping the book for support. The words, distorted and shifting in her vision, flashed before her eyes. "It has begun." Her breath quickened. She tried to drop the book, but it was as though the book was holding on to her, refusing to let go. Her fingers tingled with an electric sensation, and the room began to spin. Her head snapped up, and for a brief moment, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. A pale, shadowy shape, familiar and yet so terrifyingly distant. The figure stepped forward, and Jessica's heart skipped a beat. It was Daniel. No, it couldn't be. He had vanished months ago. The library staff had said he was gone. There was no trace of him left. But there he was, standing in front of her, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes dark, like empty wells that had once held life but had long since been drained. "Help me," Daniel's voice rasped, though it didn't sound like him at all. It sounded like something not human. "Please, help me." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The room was closing in on her, the walls narrowing, and the book in her hands was growing heavier, pulling her down into its depths. The words on the page were swirling faster now, changing again, and they began to rewrite her story, just as they had rewritten Daniel's. "She will be mine." The voice echoed in her mind, louder now, no longer a whisper, but a deafening command. Jessica's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her eyes locked on Daniel's figure as he reached for her, his face contorted in agony. "No, don't let it take you." But it was too late. The words began to burn themselves into her skin, tracing across her arms, her neck, her chest, as though the book itself were marking her. The ink that had once been cold, was now scalding, searing into her body, writing her fate onto her soul. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the shadows, consumed by the darkness that had long since overtaken this place. Daniel's figure vanished, fading into the ether as if he had never existed at all. All that remained was the book, the skin book, with its ever-turning pages and its unrelenting hunger. And just as it had taken Daniel, it was now taking her. The library seemed to fall silent once again, as if nothing had happened, as though Jessica had simply vanished, as though she had never even existed. The skin book, however, sat untouched, its pages still moving, still writing, capturing the essence of its victims, their souls bound forever within its leather cover. In the days that followed, the library continued its normal rhythm. The staff carried on, oblivious to the terrible secrets lurking in the back corner where the book lay. The strange occurrences, the inexplicable disappearances, no one seemed to connect the dots. Life went on, but the book waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Another young librarian, Ethan, began his shift at the library, eager to start his new job. He had heard rumors of the old, hidden section at the back, of the strange stories about missing staff members, about books that had claimed lives. But like all those who came before him, he dismissed them as nothing more than tall tales. It wasn't long before Ethan found himself drawn to that dark corner of the library, the forbidden section where no one dared go. The air was thick with dust, the shelves old and weathered, as though they had been left untouched for years. A sense of unease crawled over his skin, but he shook it off, curious to explore. His hand reached out to the shelf, and his fingers brushed the spine of a book. A strange shiver ran down his spine. He pulled it out slowly, his eyes scanning the cover, smooth and unmarked, except for faint symbols that seemed to shift, like shadows in the dark. The book felt wrong. It felt as though it didn't belong here, as though it had been waiting for him. Before he could open it, a cold gust of wind swept through the library, though there were no open windows. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching longer, as if the light itself was being pulled into the book. Ethan froze, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. A whisper tickled at the back of his mind, soft at first, then louder, clearer. "You belong to me." It was the same voice, the same cold presence that had spoken to Daniel, to Jessica. His hand trembled as he opened the book, not able to stop himself. The words danced on the pages, shifting and twisting, blurring his vision. They weren't just words anymore. They were like a presence, a dark energy pressing down on him, suffocating him. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to close the book, but it was too late. The ink began to seep from the pages, dark tendrils curling into the air, wrapping around his body, his throat, his mind. "Stop, stop." Ethan screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the thickening shadows. His skin burned as the ink latched onto him, digging into his flesh. His body spasmed, and the book continued to write, tracing his every movement, his every thought. "It's happening again," he whispered, his mind fading. "I can't escape." His eyes darted to the door, but the library had changed. The walls were no longer familiar. They were closing in, twisting, warping. The floor beneath him felt soft, shifting, as though it had turned into liquid, threatening to swallow him whole. The words, those dark, swirling words, were now everywhere. On the walls, on the ceiling, in his mind. "You will be mine, Ethan. Forever." The words seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, sending waves of agony through his body. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His head was spinning, his thoughts fragmenting, as the book's power took hold. And then, just like that, he was gone. Days passed. The library was quiet. Too quiet. The staff noticed the absence of Ethan, but no one questioned it. The skin book had claimed him, and his name, like all the others, was lost to the darkness. The book remained in its corner, waiting, ever patient, ever hungry. It was a cycle, one that had repeated itself for decades, centuries even. The book had been passed from hand to hand, claiming new victims, consuming their lives and their stories. No one knew how it had come to be. No one knew how to stop it. It was a thing of legend, a thing of horror, and it would never end. Somewhere, deep in the bowels of the library, the skin book lay, its pages forever turning, its ink forever fresh. The lives it had consumed were written into its pages, their stories never-ending, trapped in the book's eternal grasp. And somewhere, in the depths of the darkened library, a new figure stood, watching, waiting for its turn to fall under the book's spell. It was only a matter of time. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.